Have a Nice Death has a solid and fun gameplay foundation. It has the potential to be a really great game, but it's definitely falling short right now. So let's talk about what I like about this game so far, and where I hope to see it improved in the future as it continues in early access. Have a Nice Death is a 2D platformer hack and slash roguelite that released into early access a couple weeks ago. The core gameplay loop involves running through areas with basic platforming, with occasional ambush encounters. We are required to clear a set number of enemies before continuing on. At every 5th level, you encounter a boss that you must clear before going on to the next area. After clearing each floor, you can choose the reward for the next one. So for example, increase health, a chance to get a new weapon, things like that. And that means you can select to face a mini-boss as well if you choose to for an increased reward. As I mentioned, it's a hack and slash game, so you'll often spam attacks to deal more damage and stun lock enemies. Most enemies enter a dazed or stagger state where they don't do anything. You can deal a lot of damage and finish them off before they return to normal functioning. The game also has a dash that you can use to reposition yourself or avoid attacks. And it has a medium length cooldown, so you'll have to be deliberate with its use and not just spam it constantly. Since you play as Death, per the name of the game, your staple weapon is a scythe, which you start every run with and makes up your basic attacks. You can also pick up 2 different weapons or equipment items throughout your run. These different items or weapons can have more range, deal massive AoE damage, or have more simple swinging attacks. There's actually a lot of variety there, which is a good element of the game. These typically either have a cooldown or mana cost in order to use. Honestly though, I would say I probably use the scythe's basic attacks for 90% of my attacks because of those long cooldowns or mana costs. But some of these weapons are really powerful and fun to use, and that great AoE damage can be incredibly valuable. You can also combo between the weapons and your scythes, but I found that just spam attacking with a scythe was often the most effective or quickest method for clearing most encounters. You also have a frenzy meter that builds up whenever you deal damage. You can activate it when full to do a special attack for your scythe or either of your 2 additional weapons. I also liked how the scythe had a lot of directional attacks and different attack chains when in the air versus on the ground. Some weapons also had this expanded moveset, but a lot were more straightforward. Overall, I actually loved the feel of the combat, and I would say it's one of the 2 biggest selling points of this game for me. It reminded me a lot of Hades in terms of that hack and slash style, though obviously this is a platformer. And I'm going to talk about a number of flaws with this game as we get more into it, but the core gameplay experience is just really fun and enjoyable, and that's why I think this game has a lot of potential to be really great in the future. Outside of these weapons and upgrading them, you can also collect curses for your run, which I guess are the main build crafting element. These can be more straightforward, so giving you more health, or they can have more unique modifiers, such as making your attacks deal bleed damage, or ones that make comboing between weapons more effective. I think the build crafting in this game right now is okay. There's room for some cool and powerful synergies, but most of the time, my playstyle didn't drastically change depending on what curses I built. Which is partly because, as I mentioned earlier, I mostly just spam attacked with a scythe, and different builds didn't really change that. Have a Nice Death also differs from a lot of roguelites that have come out in the last few years because it has no permanent vertical progression across runs. The only form of meta progression in the game comes in the form of unlocking new items or weapons for future runs. You can unlock these by completing specific challenges or achievements, or alternatively, you can buy them for gold, a currency you collect at the end of each run, depending on how far you went, how well you did, etc. I actually really loved how each weapon was unlocked in this game. You're either buying it with currency, completing specific achievements or challenges, or beyond that, if you had partially completed a challenge. So, for example, if you had killed 5 out of 10 mini-bosses that were required to unlock a weapon, you could buy that weapon at a reduced cost. This was a pretty simple but incredibly satisfying way of combining different unlock systems, and I'm almost surprised that I haven't seen somebody do this before. I like the system because working through specific challenges is a fun goal to work for. You can also buy your way out of challenges you didn't want to do or challenges that were annoying. I hope to see some more games work with a system like this at some point in the future. Overall, despite it being in early access, I mostly only encountered relatively minor bugs. For example, the game didn't hide my mouse when I was using my controller, which was a little annoying, but not the biggest deal in the world. I also occasionally had problems with clipping into enemies when I dashed, which would make me rebound backwards, and that would make me take more damage than I wanted to. But overall, these bugs were pretty minor and didn't majorly impact my gameplay experience, with a couple exceptions that I'll talk about later on. Now let's briefly talk about the art design and narrative elements in Have a Nice Death, because it's probably the second biggest selling point of the game to me. Before each run, and at some points in the middle of each run, you can talk to various NPCs or listen in on their conversations. It's mostly entertaining or funny one-liners and short dialogue, but there are some occasionally more meaningful conversation that flesh out the game's story and lore. On that note, you're playing as Death, CEO of Death Incorporated, and you've made the previous mistake of delegating some of your work of collecting souls to underlings called the Sorrows, who are not doing a great job, to put it bluntly. A lot of the jokes and humor in this game center around that imaginary office culture, and it's just an enjoyable setting to explore. I did occasionally have some problems where I couldn't read all the dialogue because it would scroll past it, or the dialogue box itself would close before I was finished. I don't really know what was happening there, but definitely some small tweaks are needed in terms of that presentation. The art style in this game is also really nice. There's a lot of detail and attention put into the animations and designs of all of these characters. However, I do think the game might be a little too grayscale. I like the aesthetic choice of limited colors, but there's so little color in the game, it makes a lot of the areas feel very similar. And this is a huge shame because you can see how much work was put into these areas. You can see these areas have meaningful differences, but that limited color palette really made those areas mesh together more than they would have otherwise. Still, as a whole, I really like the overall art design of this game, and I'm really excited to see where they go with this in the future. So now let's talk about the biggest areas where I think this game needs to improve on what it's doing in its early access period. So let's start with some more typical early access complaints. The game just needs more content, which is not surprising because it's early access. It needs more enemies and boss variety. It's not awful right now, but if this was a full release game with this amount of variety, I would be disappointed personally. I think the weapon item variety right now is also okay, but the game really needs some more alternatives and variety to the basic attack scythe. Because you have the scythe for each run, you start with it, and I use that scythe for most of my attacks, as I mentioned earlier. It made each run feel a little too samey, a little too similar after a while. You can unlock alternative and improved scythe movesets within each run, but it's hard to do that reliably because it requires a special resource that you can't always get. I will say though, once you actually get those scythe alternatives, those upgraded scythes, they are really fun to play around with. These variety issues are mostly just issues of working on the game more, so I'm not too worried about those being addressed in the future. But they do limit my current replayability and how much I want to play the game right now. So now let's talk about some areas for improvement that I would like to see that are not variety focused. They're perhaps a little deeper, but I'd like to see them addressed before the game gets full release. First, the level design as it stands right now is a little boring. Each level feels pretty similar, and while some levels have an extra hidden reward if you can find that path, it's never that hidden, it's never that hard to find. So for the most part, each level feels incredibly linear and simple. Additionally, killing the basic enemies on each floor gives almost no rewards whatsoever. They do occasionally drop items for you, like health or souls, which is the currency within each run, but for the most part, you can just run past all these enemies and be perfectly fine. Second, healing just feels off in this game. There are two main types of healing. The first, more normal type of healing, acts like healing in most games, where it just fills up your HP bar a set amount. So for example, a 25 heal will just heal you 25. But the more common heals are anima, which use an injury system. Basically, whenever you take damage, some of that damage is more permanent damage, and some of that damage is left as injury. So if you lose 20 health from an attack, 5 HP is a more permanent loss, while 15 HP will be lost and marked as injury health. This injury health can be restored with anima, which are healing items you find throughout your run, but anima cannot restore non-injured health loss. I think the idea behind this system is that you can't fully heal up the damage you're taking, so healing gets less and less valuable as the run goes on. If you keep taking damage over time, you will eventually not be able to heal up. But the whole healing balance right now just feels off. I had a very wide variety across runs in terms of how much healing I had, and flat healing items interact with the injury system in a very weird way. This game also feels like an attrition game to me, which means that I often had my health whittled down from taking random hits, and I'm not sure I liked how the war of attrition style of the game interacts with that injury system. Honestly, if I was early on in a run and took a hit or two by accident, I would just restart the run, and that's something I usually hate doing in roguelites. I think it's hard to articulate the exact problem with the system, partly because it's a little confusing to me how flat healing, injury, and anima all interact with each other. Sometimes they do things I don't expect, but I think healing needs a rework or rebalance or just some sort of fix in this game. Notably, the developers did announce last week they are working to address this with future updates, so stay tuned to see if that's fixed in early access. Finally, there are a couple of enemies and bosses that re-aim attacks mid-swing. One example of this is the mini-boss on the first floor. This might be a bug, but I think it's more likely that this is actually intended, because if you dodge later on, you can consistently avoid the attacks. I just found it annoying as I played through to have the enemy wind up, get ready to attack to the right, then suddenly attack to the left because I dodged that way. The re-aiming itself wasn't annoying, but it didn't really match the animations, so it was hard to tell and it was hard to predict, and because of that, it just felt unfair at times, and I was taking extra hits that I just wasn't expecting. Honestly, that first mini-boss in general seems a little buggy, but the same re-aiming mid-animation process happens with some enemies on the second floor as well, which makes you think again that it's a design choice and not a bug. I think these 3 big areas for improvements could be addressed in early access. And as I mentioned earlier, the developers have already stated they're working on that second one, they're working on fixing the healing. But as always with early access games, to be determined whether it actually pans out. So what's my verdict on Have a Nice Death? The core gameplay is solid, and in my opinion, that's the most important thing for starting out in early access. It's a lot easier to add more variety than it is to add that core fun gameplay experience. And honestly, Have a Nice Death can be really fun to play when that core gameplay comes together. If you're looking for a new hack and slash roguelite with no strict vertical progression or cross-run upgrades, this can fill that niche incredibly well. I also really love the art style and storytelling in this game. However, this game still has a lot of different areas that could use some improvement. By nature of being early access, the game just needs more content. The level design could also use some improvement, and healing needs a rework. I really enjoy the core gameplay, so I hope to see this game get more updates and succeed in the future. I don't think you need to rush out and buy this game right now, but I would recommend keeping an eye on it, adding it to your Steam wishlist, or however you keep track of your games, because this game is fun to play, and at $15, it's probably worth buying at some point in the future, even if you don't want to buy it right now. Huge shout out to all of our channel members, thank you for your support, and help making videos like this one possible. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.